The heavy glass paperweight sat near the edge of my desk, catching the gray afternoon light. It was a custom retirement gift from Commissioner Henderson, given to me after I single-handedly saved this manufacturing plant from a massive EPA-compliant shutdown. It was a solid, reassuring weight in my palm, representing 15 years of late nights, detailed records, and personal relationships with every inspector in the state. That paperweight was the first thing that moved when Brenda Foster from HR walked into my corner office and set a cardboard banker's box on top of my mahogany desk. I looked up from my laptop, my hand still resting on the cool glass. Brenda would not meet my eyes. Instead, she stared at a point just over my left shoulder, where a young woman in a sharp navy blazer stood waiting. "She has an MBA from Wharton," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a flat professional monotone. "You will understand, Edward. The board wants fresh eyes on regulatory compliance." The young woman stepped into my office without being invited, her eyes scanning the room as if she were already measuring the walls for new shelving. She did not look at me. She looked at the view of the valley through my windows. "I am Clara Jennings," she said, extending a hand that I ignored. "I graduated at the top of my class. The board is bringing in modern management principles to streamline our compliance operations." 15 years, I thought. I had spent 15 years building a shield around this company, memorizing the compliance manuals, learning the quirks and preferences of every state and federal regulator, and keeping us running while the executives played golf. "The nameplate on your door is outdated," Clara added, running a finger along the brass edge. "I can have a new one ordered by tomorrow morning." I did not say a word. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice. I simply stood up, opened my middle desk drawer, and took out my personal leather-bound compliance journal. It contained 15 years of handwritten notes on every regulatory inspection this plant had ever undergone. I placed it quietly inside the cardboard box, alongside my family photos and the glass paperweight. Brenda stood there awkwardly, pretending to help me pack. "The federal audit team is arriving at 4 o'clock this afternoon," I told them as I picked up my box. "We have it covered," Brenda said, shuffling some files on the desk that was no longer mine. "Will you?" I asked. "Commissioner Bradley is leading the audit today. His son William is currently deployed overseas, and his arthritis flares up when the weather is damp. He takes his coffee black with 1 sugar cube, and he expects the lead manager to know the exact revisions to Code 42 that were published last month." Clara laughed, a light, dismissive sound. "I memorized the federal handbook during my orientation week," she said. "I am quite sure I can handle a basic inspection." I nodded once, laid my plastic keycard on the desk, and walked out. The entire 3rd floor went silent as I walked past the open cubicles. Alice Brady from accounting looked down at her calculator, and Roy Higgins from legal stared intensely at his computer screen. Not a single person spoke up or met my eyes. They knew what was happening, and they were too afraid for their own jobs to say anything. By 3 in the afternoon, I was sitting in my truck in the parking lot. The rain was beginning to patter against the windshield, creating a blur of gray across the company sign. I watched the black government SUVs pull into the visitor parking spots. My phone began to buzz with frantic text messages from my former team members, but I ignored them. At exactly 3:47, the glass lobby doors burst open. Audrey Miller, the assistant to CEO Donald Thorne, ran out into the rain. She was not wearing a coat, and her heels splashed through the puddles as she scanned the parking lot. When she spotted my silver truck, she ran toward me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I rolled down my window just a few inches, allowing the damp wind to carry her voice. "Please, Edward," she gasped, holding her wet hair back from her face. "Commissioner Bradley is threatening an automatic failure and a shutdown order. He refuses to speak to anyone but you." Clara tried showing him her Wharton diploma, and he walked out of the conference room. "He says if you are not in that room in 10 minutes, he is shutting down production. The CEO told me to offer you whatever you want. Anything at all." I looked at the dashboard clock. "How is that MBA working out for everyone?" I asked. "If you have ever spent years building something only to watch it handed over to someone who did not earn it, you know the feeling. It is a quiet, cold anger that demands total vindication." I did not want a quick apology. I wanted them to realize that my 15 years of experience was the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. My name is Edward Vance, and I do not have a fancy degree. What I have is institutional knowledge that cannot be bought. I started here straight out of community college, working my way up from the factory floor to regulatory manager. Manufacturing regulations are thicker than encyclopedias. One critical violation can cost $30 million in fines or shut down the line for months. I learned every detail, and now they were about to learn what that was worth. The rain continued to pour, drumming a steady rhythm on the roof of my truck. Audrey stood there shivering, her wet clothes clinging to her frame, her eyes pleading for a lifeline. The company was facing a critical violation, a disaster that could tank our stock by 30% by the time the market opened tomorrow. I checked my watch. We had exactly 8 minutes before Commissioner Bradley walked out and signed the order. I looked at Audrey. I will return under 4 conditions, I told Audrey. First, I want the Chief Compliance Officer title with a 50% salary raise. Second, restore my corner office immediately. Third, Clara Jennings must work as my assistant for 6 months to learn how compliance functions in the real world. Audrey nodded rapidly, writing the words down on her wet notepad. And the fourth? She asked. Lillian Cole, the board chair, must personally apologize to me in front of the entire executive team at our next meeting, I said. Audrey gasped. Lillian is the board chair, Edward. She will never agree to that. Then tell Donald to enjoy explaining a $30 million fine and a production freeze to the shareholders, I replied, and began to roll my window back up. Audrey hesitated for a second, then turned and ran back toward the building, her wet heels clicking against the asphalt. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from CEO Donald Thorne himself. The message was short and clear. All terms accepted. Come inside. I smiled, adjusted my collar, and stepped out of my truck. I walked through the lobby, my boots squeaking on the polished marble. The senior directors who had looked away when I left watched me pass with relief and embarrassment. The executive hallway was lined with managers who had suddenly found their courage, nodding at me as I passed. When I entered the main conference room, the atmosphere was freezing. Commissioner Bradley sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his face a mask of absolute authority. 2 junior inspectors sat beside him, reviewing their tablets. Clara Jennings was sitting in the corner, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a leather binder. Donald Thorne was standing by the window, looking older than his 55 years. The moment Commissioner Bradley saw me, his stern expression softened. Cutting it close, Edward, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. I had a flat tire. Commissioner, I replied, taking a seat at the table. How is your son William doing? I heard he was deployed. He is getting adjusted, Bradley said, a small smile breaking through his gruff exterior. The heat is rough, but he says the local coffee is worse than my cooking. His eyes shifted toward Clara, who shrank back into her seat. Your new colleague here was trying to tell me that we do not need to document the chemical storage temperatures for Category 4 compounds because of the new federal amendments. I shook my head slowly. That is only true if we pass the optional stability testing approved last quarter, Commissioner. Since we are still using the older storage protocols, we are fully bound by Section 12 of the Federal Code. Commissioner Bradley raised an eyebrow, looking at me with a satisfied nod. You actually read the subclauses, he said. I helped draft the industry feedback on those revisions, I reminded him. For the next 3 hours, I led the audit team through our records. We walked down to the secondary line where the steel tanks were humming. I pointed out the pressure readings, explaining how our localized pressure relief valves exceeded the regulations by 15%. The junior inspectors, who were ready to write a warning based on Clara's confusing explanations, took notes on our safety measures instead. Clara stood behind us, her cheeks flushed as she realized her theoretical models did not account for our custom-built configurations. I did not need a handbook. I knew every file, every inspection date, and every technician by name. I explained our maintenance cycles, showed them our secondary containment systems, and addressed every concern before it could become a finding. Clara followed us silently, carrying my notebook, and watching how compliance actually works. It is not about reciting rules from a textbook. It is about trust and showing the inspectors that you respect their job. When Bradley finally signed the compliance certificate, Declaring our plant fully cleared, he unclipped his heavy pen and signed his name at the bottom of the form with a flourish, his hands steady despite the arthritis. He handed me the duplicate copy, our fingers brushing against the paper. "Take care of yourself, Edward," he said. "We need guys like you who actually know the difference between a real hazard and a typo." I smiled, folding the document, while Donald Thorne let out a breath he had been holding for hours. He pulled me into his office. "You saved us, Edward," Donald said, his voice trembling. "We made a massive mistake yesterday." "Yes, you did," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I want my office cleared of Clara's things by tomorrow morning. I want the human resources paperwork for my new title on my desk by 9 o'clock. And remember, Lillian Cole owes me an apology." Donald nodded quickly, agreeing to everything. What he did not know was that I had not come back just to save the audit. I had returned with a long-term plan. For 15 years, I had watched this company take its workers for granted, believing that credentials mattered more than loyalty. I was going to use my new authority to restructure the entire compliance division, putting the power where it belonged. Clara Jennings was going to learn a lesson she could never buy at Wharton, and Lillian Cole was about to find out what happens when you underestimate the man who keeps your company safe. By next morning, my corner office was restored. Clara's diplomas were gone, replaced by my regulatory journals and paperweight. Through the glass wall of my office, I could see Clara Jennings sitting at the small assistant's desk just outside my door. It was the same desk I had occupied 15 years ago as a clerk. She was typing furiously, her jaw clenched in silent anger. Clara's shoulders slumped as I walked out and placed a stack of dusty folders on her desk. She picked up the first folder, her manicured nails tapping against the cardboard. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the memory of the previous day's near disaster kept her silent. "I need you to organize the inspection records from the last 6 quarters, I said calmly. "Sort them by inspector, category, and response time." Clara looked up, her eyes flashing with resentment. "I have an MBA, Edward," she said, her voice tight. "I am capable of doing actual analysis, not just sorting files, then analyze why we had 3 minor labeling findings last year under Inspector Beatrice," I replied. "Let me know what you find by noon. By the way, Commissioner Bradley called this morning. He wants to review our pipeline schedules next week. He asked if you had memorized the amendments yet." Her face went pale at the mention of the commissioner's name. "I will get to work on the files," she muttered, looking down and opening the first folder, her eyes squinting at the dense compliance logs I had kept by hand. It was the start of her education, one file at a time. I went back into my office and began reviewing the corporate bylaws. I was looking for the exact structure of the board's authority. Lillian Cole, the board chair, had been pushing to outsource our entire compliance department to an external software vendor called Nexus Compliance Solutions. It was a move she claimed would save the company money, but my experience told me otherwise. Technology cannot build trust with federal inspectors. At 2 in the afternoon, the door to my office swung open. Lillian Cole walked in without knocking, her expensive heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Brenda Foster from HR followed behind her, looking nervous. Lillian stood over my desk, her arms crossed and her eyes cold, her perfume filling the room with an overpowering scent of lavender and expensive soap. "This is absurd," Lillian snapped, throwing a memo onto my desk. "You are demanding a formal apology from me in front of the entire executive team." "Who do you think you are, Edward? I am the Chief Compliance Officer, who just saved this company from a shutdown that would have cost $30 million, I said, leaning back in my chair. "And you are the board chair, who almost caused it by replacing me with someone who did not know the basic regulations." "The board is not interested in your personal notes, Edward," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We are a multi-million-dollar enterprise, and we cannot base our compliance strategy on your handwritten diary. We will be outsourcing compliance to Nexus within the quarter." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder. "Before you do that, Lillian, you might want to look at this," I said, sliding the folder across the desk. She did not touch it. "What is that?" she asked. "It is a detailed breakdown of the ownership structure of Nexus Compliance Solutions," I said. "It turns out that the parent company of Nexus is registered in Delaware, and one of the primary shareholders is a holding company owned by your brother." Under California corporate law, specifically the rules governing a breach of fiduciary duty, a director cannot vote on or promote contracts where they have a direct or indirect financial interest without full disclosure to the board. You never disclose this interest, Lillian. If this contract is signed, it is void ab initio, and you will be facing a personal lawsuit for breach of the duty of loyalty. Lillian's expression froze. The color drained from her face, and she stared at the folder on my desk. Brenda Foster gasped, looking between the two of us. "This is blackmail," Lillian whispered, her voice shaking. "This is compliance," I replied. "I protect this company from external threats, and that includes internal ones." Now about that formal apology. The executive meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 10 in the morning. I expect you to be there, and I expect you to read the statement I have drafted for you. If you are not there, this folder goes to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the rest of the board. Lillian stared at me for a long moment, her hands clenching into fists. Without another word, she turned and walked out of my office, and Brenda followed. The next morning, the executive boardroom was packed. Donald Thorne sat at the head of the table, looking nervous, while the rest of the vice presidents whispered among themselves. Lillian Cole stood at the podium, her posture stiff, her face pale. She cleared her throat and began to read from the paper I had provided. "I want to formally apologize to our Chief Compliance Officer, Edward Vance," she said, her voice flat and strained. "My decision to replace him was made without understanding the value of institutional knowledge and relationship management. It was a significant error in judgment that nearly cost this company millions of dollars." I sat at the table, nodding politely. Behind me, Clara Jennings was sitting in the corner, taking notes. I could see the look of absolute shock on her face. She was beginning to realize that the corporate world was not run by textbooks, but by power, leverage, and preparation. Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic in our department began to change. Clara Jennings stopped complaining about her tasks. She spent her hours reviewing the old compliance records, asking me detailed questions about why I had handled certain inspections the way I did. I took her with me to a lunch meeting with Inspector Beatrice. I wanted Clara to see how a compliance manager builds a relationship. We sat at a corner booth in the local diner, the smell of grease and coffee in the air. Beatrice was checking her folder, but her eyes lit up when I asked about her golden retriever, Buster, who had been sick last month. We spent 20 minutes discussing vet recommendations before we even touched the compliance documents. When we finally opened the reports, her tone was entirely cooperative. Beatrice agreed to give us an informal warning instead of an official citation for a minor piping issue we had discovered. On the way back to the office, Clara was silent for a long time. "Why did you spend 40 minutes talking about shelter dogs?" she finally asked. "Because Beatrice needs to know we are decent people who care about our community," I explained. "If she trusts us personally, she trusts our compliance reports. They do not teach that in business school, Clara." "No, they do not," Clara said quietly. "They teach us to look at numbers and efficiency. They do not teach us about the human element." She looked out the window, lost in thought. "I am sorry for how I acted when I first arrived, Edward. I thought I knew everything because of my degree." I nodded, accepting her apology. "You are smart, Clara. You just need to learn that compliance is about people, not just rules. If you pay attention, you will make a great manager one day." That afternoon, Director of Operations Sean Mercer knocked on my door. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "We need to talk, Edward," he said, his voice low. "Lillian Cole is not backing down. She has been meeting with outside consultants from a technology firm. They are proposing a new digital compliance system that would eliminate your department entirely, replacing your staff with automated reporting software." I laughed, leaning back in my chair. "They want to replace us with software? Good luck getting a computer program to negotiate with Commissioner Bradley when a line leaks." Sean did not laugh. "Lillian is desperate, Edward. You embarrassed her, and she wants you gone. She is using her influence with the major investment groups to push this software transition. If the board votes to approve the software contract, you will be out of a job and the company will be exposed." I thanked Sean for the warning and immediately got to work. I asked Clara to help me gather all the correspondence and contract drafts related to the proposed software transition. She did not hesitate. For 3 days, we worked late into the night, analyzing the software specifications and the contract terms. Clara's financial background proved invaluable. She spent hours in the file room, her laptop open next to stacks of vendor agreements. She was methodical, her training at Wharton finally showing its strength when it came to financial forensics. When she brought the documents to my desk, her eyes were wide with a mix of exhaustion and excitement. She had found a pattern of expedited payments to a shell corporation that bypassed our standard accounting controls. It was a trail that led directly to Lillian's family holdings. Even worse, Clara discovered that the authorization signatures on the preliminary contract were dated 3 weeks ago, before the board had even voted on the project. One of those signatures belonged to CEO Donald Thorne, but the handwriting was slightly off. I pulled the original signature page under the desk lamp. The loops on the letter D in Donald's name were too rounded, lacking the sharp upward stroke that characterized his actual signature. Clara had printed out 3 years of board meeting logs to verify Donald's presence, showing that on the day the preliminary contract was allegedly signed in Sacramento, Donald had actually been attending a supplier conference in Chicago. He could not have signed it. Lillian had signed it herself, thinking no one would ever verify the dates. It was a desperate move by a woman who thought she was untouchable. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a signature on a commercial contract is a felony. Furthermore, under corporate law, any contract executed through forgery is void ab initio. Lillian had committed a crime to force this outsourcing contract through, desperate to cover up her financial connection to the vendor before my investigation became public. I looked at Clara, who was staring at the forged document in shock. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We prepare for the emergency board meeting on Thursday," I said. "I want you to draft a financial impact report showing the cost of a compliance failure under an automated system. I will handle the legal and regulatory side." Clara nodded, her face determined. "I am with you, Edward." She was no longer the arrogant MBA graduate who wanted my office. She was a compliance officer, ready to protect the company from its own corrupt leadership. We had the evidence we needed to destroy Lillian's plan, but I knew we had to time it perfectly. The upcoming board meeting would be our only chance to strike. The air in the executive boardroom was thick with tension as the board members took their seats. Lillian Cole sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her expression cold and confident. CEO Donald Thorne sat next to her, looking pale and uneasy. Clara Jennings stood near the back of the room, holding our presentation folders. "Agenda Item 3, Donald announced, his voice tight. "The proposed transition to the Nexus compliance software system." Lillian stood up to speak. "This transition will save the company $4 million annually by automating our compliance reporting," she said, looking directly at me. "It is time to modernize our operations and eliminate outdated, manual systems." I stood up, holding a folder in my hand. "Before the board votes on this proposal, I would like to share some critical information," I said. Lillian frowned. "This is a board vote, Edward. Your input is not required at this stage." "I think the board will find this very relevant," I replied, as Clara began distributing the folders to each member. "In these folders, you will find evidence that our 3 main competitors, ClearPath Industries, Weber Manufacturing, and Apex Solutions, have been using automated compliance software for the past 2 years. You will also find the federal investigation reports showing that all 3 companies are currently facing criminal charges for systematically bribing mid-level regulatory officials to overlook safety violations that were missed by their automated software." The room fell completely silent. The board members representing some of the largest investment funds in the state looked at the documents with growing alarm. One elderly director, who had spent 30 years on various manufacturing boards, took off his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. "This is a disaster," he muttered, looking at Lillian. "If we are dragged into a federal bribery investigation, our reputation is finished. These companies are facing $50 million in fines, and their executives are facing prison time," I continued. "Our plant has maintained a perfect compliance record because we do not rely on software to catch errors. We rely on experienced people and relationships built on trust. If we transition to this software, we will be audited under the same federal investigation, I said. Without our established relationships and manual verification, we will be presumed guilty by association. Our stock price will collapse. Donald Thorne leaned forward, his eyes wide. Is this investigation public? He asked. It will be public in 27 days, I replied. The Regulatory Commission has already asked for my personal testimony as an industry expert. They trust us because of our record. Lillian Cole slammed her hands on the table. This is nothing but fear-mongering, she shouted. The contract with Nexus is already negotiated and will save us millions. I looked at her calmly. The contract with Nexus is a felony, Lillian. I slid the forgery analysis across the table. 3 weeks ago, you forged Donald Thorne's signature on the preliminary contract to lock in the pricing. Under California Penal Code, Section 470, that is forgery. The contract is void ab initio, and you have breached your fiduciary duty of loyalty to this company by promoting a contract with a vendor where you hold a secret financial interest, I said. I have already forwarded this evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The boardroom erupted into chaotic shouting. Several board members stood up, demanding explanations. Lillian stared at the forgery analysis, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. Donald Thorne looked at the forged signature, his face flushing with anger. You forged my name, Lillian, he whispered. The board meeting was adjourned immediately. Lillian Cole left the building through the back exit, her assistant carrying her personal belongings in a designer bag. The news of her resignation was framed as a retirement for personal reasons, but everyone in the executive offices knew the truth. Within 2 days, the board formally voted to reject the Nexus proposal and approved a resolution praising my department's vigilance. 2 weeks later, the federal investigation into our competitors became public. Their stock prices plummeted, while our company was praised in the national media as a model of regulatory compliance and corporate integrity. Our stock value increased by 30% in a single day, and we secured several major government manufacturing contracts that had been stripped from our competitors. I sat in my expanded office, my hand resting on the glass paperweight. Donald Thorne walked in, carrying a new brass nameplate. He set it on my desk. You saved the company, Edward, he said quietly. I want you to serve as Executive Vice President of Compliance and Ethics with a seat on the board. I looked at the new nameplate, then looked out the window. Thank you. Donald, I said, I accept. And I want Clara Jennings promoted to Deputy Compliance Officer. She proved her worth during this crisis. Donald nodded in agreement and walked out. I called Clara into my office and handed her the promotion paperwork. You earned this, I said. Clara stood in my doorway, holding the signed agreement, a genuine smile on her face. Her posture was different now. No longer rigid and defensive, but relaxed and confident. She had earned the respect of the entire compliance team, not because of her degree, but because she had stood by us when it mattered. I handed her the new keycard to the deputy office. Welcome aboard, Clara, I said. Thank you, Edward, she said. I promise I will not stop learning. She walked out to her new office, and I leaned back in my chair. Poetic justice is indeed sweet. I had started 15 years ago as a simple clerk, and now I was running the department. The board had tried to replace experience with credentials and software, but in the end it was experience that saved them. The game had changed, and I had rewritten the rules.